She had 6 heartbeats to protect, and no one was coming for her. The snow had been falling since noon, thick and indifferent, the kind that muffled the world into a single, flat silence, broken only by the whimpering of small bodies pressed against her sides. Mara had counted the pups twice, touching each one the way her mother had taught her to count blessings, not because she believed in such things anymore, but because the act of touching them kept her hands busy and her mind away from the cold spreading up from the cave floor and into her knees. 6 pups, none older than 8 weeks. 3 were orphaned. 2 belonged to a pack member who had gone for help before the storm hit and had not returned. And the smallest, the runt she had started calling Thread because he was almost nothing at all, was hers. Thread was the reason she was in the forest in the first place. She should not have been here. And Omega did not wander the eastern ridge without permission, without escort, without a documented reason filed with the pack's border warden. But Thread had followed a scent into the snow, and Mara had followed Thread, and then the storm had swallowed the sky, and there was no going back. There was only this shallow cave in the rock face, and 6 pups, and the cold pressing in from every direction like a question she did not know how to answer. She gathered them closer. All 6 arranged against her stomach and chest, tucked beneath the wool overshirt she had unlaced and spread wide to create a pocket of shared warmth. Thread burrowed deepest, past the others, until she could feel his tiny nose pressed flat against the skin over her ribs. She curved herself around them and breathed slow, and counted her heartbeats alongside theirs and tried not to think about what morning might find when it came. She was not afraid for herself. That was the strangest part. She was afraid for them. The wind outside screamed something wordless against the rock, and Mara tightened her arms around the pups and closed her eyes, and the cold kept coming. She had been an Omega her whole life, which meant she had spent her whole life apologizing for things she had not done, for taking up space in the pack house dining hall, for requesting secondary shifts at the grain stores when the first shift was overloaded, for existing in proximity to wolves who considered her existence a mild inconvenience at best and a contaminating presence at worst. The Ironhollow Pack was not cruel by reputation, they were efficient, which was sometimes worse, because cruelty at least implied someone cared enough to direct attention at you. Mara's mother had been Omega too, and had died of a winter fever 3 years ago. Her father was a name she had never been given. She had grown up in the Pack's edge housing, in the narrow buildings at the perimeter of the settlement, where the families with no alpha blood and no useful trades were housed in administrative tidiness. The rooms were clean, the food was sufficient, no one hurt her, precisely, though no one bothered to learn her surname either. Her designation was Mara 07, the 7th registered Omega on the pack rolls. The O was stamped on her identification card in the same plain ink as the number. She had stopped looking at the card years ago. She had a small trade. She helped at the pup nursery 2 mornings a week, and on the other mornings she worked as a carrier, walking documents and small parcels between the administrative buildings that were too minor to warrant a runner, but too physical for the elderly clerks who managed the filing rooms. She was 23 years old, which meant she had been of mating age for 5 years. And in those 5 years, not a single wolf had presented a formal claiming or an informal inquiry, and she had stopped expecting them to. Thread had come to her 6 weeks ago, left in a reed basket on the nursery step with a scrap of cloth that said simply, "Too small, take it." He was, objectively, too small. His ears had not fully opened, and his eyes were clouded at the edges, and his legs trembled when he tried to stand. The nursery matron had looked at him once, assessed his chances at approximately 0, and told Mara she could take him home if she wanted something to bury. Mara had taken him home. She had slept on the floor beside him for the first 2 weeks, waking every 90 minutes to feed him warm broth from a cloth she dipped and squeezed against his mouth. He had survived the first week, and then the second. And by the 5th week, he was walking in straight lines and eating solid food and following her everywhere in the small room, with an intensity of devotion that made something in her chest ache with a feeling she could not name, because the closest word she knew for it was chosen, and she had not been chosen by anything before. So when Thread had bolted into the snow chasing a smell she had not recognized, she had not hesitated. She had run after him. She had found him, eventually, but the storm had found them both faster, and now here they were, A not quite nothing girl and 6 not quite nothing pups in a cave in the rock, sharing what warmth they had between them. Thread shifted against her ribs and made the sound he made when he was not afraid, but simply present, a low, satisfied hum that no wolf should be making at his age. And Mara pressed her mouth against the top of his head and breathed. Outside, the wind shifted. It was a small shift. The kind of shift that didn't register as significant unless you had spent your whole life learning to read the spaces between things, the pauses before someone spoke, the silences that followed a door closing, the particular quality of an intake of breath that meant something was about to change. Mara had spent her whole life learning exactly those things, so she felt the shift. She lifted her head and looked toward the cave mouth. Nothing yet, only dark and blowing white. But something was coming. She had known the Ironhollow Pack existed at the edge of a larger territorial arrangement. She knew it the way everyone knew it, in the vague, administrative way that facts about your world live in you without being examined. The Ironhollow Pack was one of 17 packs under the Northern Territorial Accord, and the accord was overseen by the Alpha King's court. And the Alpha King was the kind of fact that lived at the extreme edge of her world, so far from her actual daily life that he might as well have been weather or geology. He was called Kale. That was all she knew about him, except what the rest of the pack whispered, that he was large, that he was cold, that he had never taken a mate despite being 31 years old, which in pack law made him technically derelict in a duty he did not appear to care about. Some said he had tried and failed to bond. Some said the bond simply did not work for him, that he was too cold for it, that his wolf was too controlled, too contained, to recognize the pull. Some said this with awe, and some with pity, and some with a particular kind of relish that meant they were glad the impossibility existed in someone else. None of this had anything to do with Mara until the night the border scout nearly kicked Thread in the dark. It had been 3 weeks before the storm, a routine perimeter check in which 2 of the King's outriders had accompanied the Ironhollow border warden on a territorial documentation exercise. The outriders were enormous in the way of alpha-blooded wolves who had spent years in the King's service, and they moved through the pack settlement with the loose efficiency of people who were accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room. Thread had been following Mara across the administrative courtyard when one of the outriders had stepped backward without looking, and his boot had come down on Thread's tail. Thread had yelped. The outrider had flinched back, startled. Mara had scooped Thread up before the outrider could process what had happened, and she had said, with a flatness that surprised her, "He's small. He doesn't show up well against the stone." The outrider had looked at her for a moment. Then he had said, "Is he yours?" "Yes." "An Omega running a pup alone?" "Yes." He had studied her for another moment, the way people studied things they were categorizing. Not unkind, exactly, just thorough. Then he had said, "What's his name?" And Mara had said, "Thread." And the outrider had looked at Thread, tiny, improbable, vibrating with offense at having been stepped on, and had made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then the warden had called him forward, and the moment had passed, and Mara had assumed she would never think about it again. She had not known then that the outrider had mentioned the exchange to his second, or that his second had mentioned it offhandedly during a route debrief in a room where the Alpha King had been present and had asked, once, a single question. What kind of Omega keeps a pup that can't survive? The kind who intends to make sure it does, the second had said. Mara had no knowledge of any of this. She only knew the cold in the cave and the weight of 6 small bodies and the sound of the storm spending itself against the rock outside. She only knew that she was an Omega with no status and no alpha blood and no ability to change the temperature of the air around her, and that she was going to keep these pups warm through the night using every piece of warmth she had in her, every last degree of it, and whatever was left of her afterward was whatever was left. She had started to doze when the sound reached her. Not the wind, not the pups, something with weight to it, something organized, footsteps in the snow outside with intention rather than accident. She snapped fully awake and curled tighter around the pups, instinct overtaking thought. She was still in partial human form, but her senses had sharpened the way they did when danger was near, and what she heard was a single set of footsteps, very large, very deliberate, and then a voice at the cave mouth that stopped all the air in her lungs. How many? It was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was a voice with such density of authority in it that it did not need volume. Low and precise, and carrying the particular resonance of an alpha who had never once needed to raise his voice to be heard in every room he had ever stood in. Mara said, still not fully processing, 6. And then, because some part of her brain was still functioning on pack etiquette, 6 pups, sir. 3 orphaned, 2 belonging to Kesta. From the 4th row she went for help before the storm came, and 1 mine. Thread. He's smallest. She paused. He's fine. They're all fine. A silence. Then, how long have you been here? Since the storm hit. Noon, approximately. It is 4 in the morning. She absorbed this. She said, I know. There was a quality to the silence that followed that she could not interpret. And then the shadow at the cave mouth became a shape, and the shape came inside, and the cave, which she had thought of as small, seemed to grow smaller still around him. He was what the whispers had said, but the whispers had been using the wrong kind of words. He was large in the way of something that had grown into its size rather than simply occupying it, not threatening, precisely, though the potential was obviously there, but rather enormous and present in the manner of something that had decided it would stand here, and by that decision made here, feel specific and anchored. He was dark-haired, winter-pale, wearing a coat lined with something that looked extremely warm. His eyes caught what little light there was in the cave and reflected it back at her, and she could not read their color. He looked at her. He looked at the 6 pups arranged over and against her. He looked at Thread, who had emerged from beneath the overshirt to observe this development with enormous clouded eyes. He said very quietly, "Move back against the wall." She moved back. He settled in front of them, enormous, a wall of alpha heat, and she felt the temperature near her face change within moments, rising from the warmth of him, and the pups stirred and began pressing toward the heat instinctively, rearranging themselves between her and this unexpected source of warmth. Mara said, without fully intending to, "You are the Alpha King." "Yes. Why are you here?" It was not quite a question the way she said it. He seemed to notice this. He said, "My outriders located your trail at the edge of the ridge. They could not follow into this terrain in wolf form in the storm. I can. You came after a set of footprints in a storm. I came after a report." He paused. An Omega and a runt pup were logged missing from the Ironhollow settlement before the storm sealed the ridge. Mara looked at him. In the growing warmth, his features were becoming clearer to her, the jaw that looked carved, the particular controlled stillness of his expression, the something beneath it that she could not name yet, but that registered to her in the way that warnings registered. Not fear exactly, but attention, a quickening of everything in her that had learned to notice the spaces between things. She said, "A report. Someone filed a report. Your nursery matron, I'm told." Mara thought of the nursery matron who had told her Thread was something to bury and had not once in 3 years asked her surname. She found she had nothing to say about this. She looked back down at the pups, at Thread, who had now climbed entirely onto the king's outstretched arm and was apparently performing a minute inspection of his sleeve. She said, "You should take them. The pups, you could carry more of them faster than I could, and you run warm. I can follow on foot." He said nothing for a moment, then, "No, the storm is easing. I can manage the terrain. I know this ridge. I've walked it before. You walked it in a different season." He looked at her. "You are exhausted. I am functional. You have been holding 6 pups with your own body heat for 16 hours. They needed it." He looked at her for a long time with that unreadable expression, and Thread made a contented sound on his sleeve. Then he said, quietly, "I know." They stayed in the cave until dawn began graying at the mouth, the king's body warmth gradually raising the temperature until Mara's hands stopped being numb and the pups settled into proper sleep rather than the fitful, cold trembling they'd been doing since midnight. She slept too, eventually, not meaning to. She felt consciousness blurring at the edges and tried to resist it and then simply could not. She was aware, at the edge of sleep, of a hand adjusting the overshirt she had been using to cover the pups, tucking it more fully around them. She was aware of Thread being settled back against her side by a very large, very careful hand. She was not aware of much after that. She woke to pale blue winter light. She was alone with the pups, which was the first thing she registered. The second thing she registered was that she was considerably warmer than she should have been. And when she looked down, she found that the king's coat, lined with that enormously warm material, had been draped over her and the pups while she slept. Thread was still tucked against her ribs. The other 5 were arranged in a breathing pile of small warmth beside her, still sleeping. The third thing she registered was a set of enormous boot prints in the snow at the cave mouth, leading away. She lay still for a moment, cataloging this. The Alpha King had been here. He had come into the eastern ridge in a blizzard alone, apparently, or nearly so, following a report about a missing Omega and a runt pup. He had sat in a cold cave for hours, generating warmth. He had covered her with his coat. He had left before she woke. She sat up carefully, not disturbing the pups. She looked at the coat. She thought about putting it aside, setting it at the cave entrance, a clear signal that she did not need anything from him, that she had managed and would continue to manage. She thought about this for several seconds. Then she wrapped it tighter and began gathering the pups. She made it back to the settlement in 2 hours of careful walking. The pups distributed between her arms and inside the coat's large pockets, a feature she suspected was not originally intended for this use, but which worked admirably. The outriders met her at the ridge's edge. They were very large and very professional, and one of them was the one who had nearly stepped on Thread 3 weeks ago. And he looked at her and looked at the pups and looked at the coat and said absolutely nothing, which she appreciated. The Ironhollow Pack house was in motion when she arrived. Kesta, the pup mother, had made it back just before the storm sealed and had spent the night in a controlled panic that the pack healers had been managing. She descended on Mara at the settlement entrance in a way that was not entirely unlike the storm itself, and there was a great deal of noise and checking of small wolf ears and tiny paws, and Mara stood in the middle of it, handing pups over and trying to be useful, and trying to feel like someone who had merely done what was needed and nothing more. The nursery matron found her afterward, when the commotion had settled. She looked at Mara for a long moment, and then she said, her voice doing something complicated, "The king asked about you." Mara absorbed this carefully. She said, "In what way?" "He came to the settlement house before dawn. He asked the pack Alpha, your full name, your designation, your household record." The matron paused. "He asked if you had claimed any formal roles beyond your carrier work." "I haven't," Mara said. "I know that." The matron looked at her hands, which was unusual. He was told. Mara waited. "He left a message for you," the matron said, and held out a folded piece of paper. It was plain, the paper. Not formal correspondence, no seal impression, no court heading. Just paper, folded once. She unfolded it. It said, in handwriting that was precise and very dark, "Your runt is not nothing. Neither are you. Return the coat when you are ready. There is no urgency." She read it twice. She read it a third time. Thread was sitting at her feet, looking up at her with his enormous clouded eyes that were, she realized, clearing slightly at the edges she could see, for the first time, that they were a specific shade, that they were, tentatively, gold. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket next to the feeling she could not name, the one that was nearest to the word chosen, and she picked Thread up and held him against her chest and breathed. She did not return the coat the next day, or the day after. She told herself there was no urgency, which was the truth, and she told herself she was not thinking about the handwriting on the paper, which was less true. She carried her documents and her parcels. She went to the nursery. She fed Thread his morning broth even though he no longer needed it, and he submitted to this with the long-suffering patience of a creature who understood she needed the ritual more than he did. On the 4th day, an outrider came to her door. He was not the one she recognized. He was younger, very formal, with the king's insignia on his collar, and he said that the Alpha King's court would be in the Ironhollow settlement for 3 additional days on matters of territorial administration, and that if it was convenient, the Alpha King would be grateful for her presence at the administrative hall at her availability. Mara looked at him. She said, "Grateful." Those were his words. She went. She brought the coat. The administrative hall in the Ironhollow settlement was a mid-sized building that had been significantly compressed by the presence of the king's retinue, which was efficient and quiet in the way of people who were accustomed to working in small spaces they had taken over from their owners. Mara walked through it, feeling the specific sensation of occupying a space that had not been calibrated for her existence, a feeling she knew well, had known her whole life, but that felt, today, more sharply particular. He was standing at the far table with two of his advisors and a territorial map, and he looked up when she came in. She felt the looking. It moved through her in a way that had no good parallel in her experience. It was not scanning, it was not assessing, it was not the particular quality of attention that meant you were being evaluated against a standard you didn't know. It was simply attention. Full, specific, directed attention, the kind that meant she was the reason the attention existed and not incidental to it. She held out the coat. She said, "Thank you for the loan." He dismissed his advisors with a word she didn't catch. They went, with the frictionless efficiency of people who understood his silences. He crossed the room and took the coat, and then he did not move away. He said, "The runt thread?" "He's improving. His eyes are clearing." "I know," I was told. A pause. I asked. She looked at him carefully. He was up close and in daylight, something she did not have a good category for. The cold exterior that the pack whispered about was real, in the sense that his default expression was a kind of studied neutrality that offered nothing, volunteered nothing, required nothing of you. But there were layers under it, she thought, that she kept catching glimpses of in the precise handwriting of a note that said, "Your runt is not nothing." In the way he had said, I know in response to her saying they needed it, in the fact that he was here at all, that he had come into the storm, that he had covered her with his coat. She said, "Why did you ask?" He said, "Because he matters to you." The simplicity of this landed in her chest and stayed there. She said, "He's just a runt." He said, "Yes," and then, "My wolf recognized your scent on the ridge before we reached the cave." She went very still. This was not she knew what it meant, the way she knew most things about her world, in the administrative way that facts lived in her without being examined. She knew it the way she knew the territorial accord existed, the way she knew the Alpha King was called Kale. She knew that a wolf recognizing a scent in that particular way, in that particular register, was not casual, was not incidental, was the furthest possible thing from administrative. She said, carefully, "What did your wolf recognize?" He held her gaze. He said, simply and without decoration, the way a man states a fact he has already decided to stop fighting. "You." The word moved through the room and settled. Thread, who had been riding in Mara's coat pocket and had apparently judged this moment appropriate for an entrance, chose this precise instant to clamber up to her shoulder and observe the proceedings with tremendous authority. A sound crossed the king's face that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. He said, "He does that often? He feels entitled to elevated positions." "He's right," the king said. Then, "His eyes are going gold." "I noticed," Mara said, "this morning." They stood there for a moment in the administrative hall with Thread on her shoulder and the territorial map behind him and the enormity of what he had just said existing in the air between them. Mara's hands were very still. Her breathing was steady. Inside her chest, something was happening that had never happened before. Not a collision, not a crisis, but a recognition, slow and warm and unavoidable, like the rising of warmth in a cold cave when a large body enters it and decides to stay. She said, "I am an Omega. I am on the 7th position roster. I don't have an Alpha designation. I don't have family lineage on record. I don't have—" "I know what you have," he said. "I was going to say I don't have anything that would make sense of this." "I know that too." He paused. "Neither do I by that measure. A king who has not bonded, who the court has been quietly suggesting is broken." His jaw moved slightly. "I have spent 6 years in negotiations with my own wolf over whether the bond simply does not work in me, whether I have suppressed it into non-existence with too much discipline and not enough, and then I followed a trail into a blizzard because a report said an omega was missing, and I came around an outcropping of rock, and the scent hit me, and my wolf stopped negotiating. Mara absorbed this for a long moment. She said, "The bond doesn't care about roster positions." "No," he said, "it does not." She looked at him. She looked at the face that the whispers had called cold, and that she could now see was something more specific than cold. It was careful. It was extremely controlled. It was the face of someone who had learned to keep most of himself below the surface, because the surface was the part that other people used against you. She recognized this. She recognized it in the particular way you recognize a thing that is also true of you. She said, "I am not afraid of being chosen." Something shifted in his expression. He said quietly, "I know. You made that clear in the cave." "I don't know anything about how this works," she said. "The formal claiming, the court, I don't know any of it. I know carrier routes and nursery schedules and how to keep 6 pups alive in a snow cave. I know territorial law and pack administration and 16 years of court protocol," he said. "Neither of those things is the relevant skill." "What is the relevant skill?" He looked at her for a moment. He said, "You stayed." She understood what he meant by this. Not that she had stayed in the cave, she'd had no choice about that, but that she had stayed in the shape of who she was, had not apologized for taking up the space she occupied, had not diminished herself in the administrative language of her designation. She had said, "He's fine, they're all fine." She had said, "I am functional." She had said, "You should take them, you run warm," meaning she had been thinking about the pups first. He had noticed all of it, she thought. He had been noticing all of it. She said, "So did you." And there it was again, that thing that was near a smile, near warmth, something that the controlled surface of him was choosing, finally, to let through. He said, "There will be complications. There are always complications for omegas. These will be court-level complications. My advisors, the pack alphas under the accord, people who have opinions about what the king's mate ought to be." "They can have opinions," Mara said. "That's allowed. They will say you are too low in designation, that you bring nothing of political value to the bond. They would be correct about the political value." She said, "I have no political value. I have excellent carrier route knowledge, and I know how to keep a runt pup alive." She looked at him squarely. "What will you say?" He held her gaze. He said, without flinching, without hedging, without the careful layered phrasing of someone buying themselves room to retreat, "I will say that my wolf chose, and I am not interested in correcting him." Something in Mara's chest, some careful, tight-held thing that she had been maintaining for 23 years, with the patience of someone who had learned not to want things too visibly, that thing released. Not dramatically, not loudly. It simply let go, like a knot worked loose by patient hands, and what replaced it was warm and wide and real. She said, "All right." Thread made a sound of approval on her shoulder and settled his tiny chin against her jaw, and the Alpha King looked at him with something in his expression that was unmistakably fond. In the days that followed, the complications arrived exactly as promised, and Mara met them in the same way she met everything: straight-backed, quiet, without apology. The first advisor who came to speak with her did so with the careful phrasing of someone trying to be kind while delivering unwelcome news, and he explained, at length, the traditional expectations of a royal mate, the lineage documentation requirements, the public designation review process that the court would need to conduct. Mara listened to all of it with her hands folded and thread in her lap, and when the advisor finished, she said, "What would you need from me to begin the process?" And he blinked, and she waited, and after a moment, he opened his folder and told her. The second advisor was less careful. He was older, broad-shouldered, with the look of someone who had been giving king's advice for long enough that he had begun to confuse giving advice with making decisions. He came on the second day of the extended settlement visit and told her, with a directness she actually found refreshing, that the king's bond recognition was a biological event and not necessarily a sovereign decision, that there was precedent for bond recognition occurring without formal claiming, that the king might come to a more measured conclusion given time and appropriate counsel. Mara said, "Are you here because the king sent you?" He hesitated. I am here in an advisory capacity. That's a no, she said. You're here on your own to ask me to step back. She studied him. She said, I appreciate the honesty of the approach. I'll be honest back. I have not asked anything of the king, and I am not asking anything of you. If he decides the complications outweigh the bond, that is his decision. It is not yours. The advisor looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him recalibrate her, watched the assessment shifting in real time from Omega Carrier Girl to something he had not yet developed a folder for. He said, You're not what I expected. I rarely am, she said. It's a feature of living at the 7th position on a roster. The third complication arrived in the form of Reva, the alpha daughter of the neighboring Ashvin Pack, who was 24 years old and beautiful in the specific way of people who have been raised to understand that their beauty is a resource to be deployed. She arrived with her pack's representatives on a visit that had been scheduled before any of the current events, some administrative boundary discussion, and she arrived understanding, clearly, that the situation with the king's mate recognition was unresolved in the court's opinion, even if the king's opinion was less uncertain. She found Mara in the settlement courtyard, which was either coincidence or it was not, and she was polite in the way of people who are being polite as a tactic. She said, You're the one the king found in the cave. Not unkind, not kind either. Simply placing. Mara said, Yes. Reva looked at her with eyes that were doing the assessment that most alphas did not bother to conceal. She said, You must know this is unusual. I know, Mara said. The bond recognition doesn't always the court has ways of managing. I know that too, Mara said. Reva paused. Then she said more quietly, with something that was not quite admiration, but was nearest to it. What did you say to him when he found you? Mara thought about this. She said, I told him to take the pups. I said I could follow on foot. Reva stared at her. She said, You told the Alpha King to take the pups and you'd walk behind. They were cold, Mara said. He runs warm. Something crossed Reva's face that she did not interpret immediately, and then she did. It was recognition. The recognition of someone who has spent their entire life being taught to present themselves as the valuable thing and who has just witnessed, for perhaps the first time, the specific and disorienting power of someone who simply is not doing that, who is not presenting anything, who is just being who she is, and letting that be enough or not. Reva said, almost to herself, How could he not choose you? And then, as if startled by her own words, I should go. The boundary meeting. She went. Thread watched her go and made a small, non-committal sound. The public declaration came on the third day, at the formal conclusion of the territorial administration session. In the settlement's open hall with the full Ironhollow Pack and the visiting representatives and the king's retinue assembled, it was a routine closing ceremony, the kind that happened at the end of every territorial visit. The Pack Alpha and the king affirming the accord, the administrative records being sealed. A few formal acknowledgments of business concluded. The king stood at the front of the hall, and Mara was at the back of it, standing near the entrance because she had come to watch without being certain she was welcome to be closer, which was where she usually stood at pack events, at the edge of things, taking up the minimum required space. Thread was on her shoulder. The king said the formal closing words. He sealed the record. He thanked the Pack Alpha for his hospitality. And then he paused. In that way, he had that she was beginning to recognize the pause that was not uncertainty, but deliberateness. The pause of a man who does everything on purpose. He said in the carrying voice that did not need to be loud, the voice that filled the hall without effort, there is one additional matter. The hall, which had been in the process of the pleasant ambient shuffling of a formal event concluding, went still. He said, under the Northern Territorial Accord, Article 7, a bond recognition by the ruling Alpha is a matter of territorial record and is to be formally declared in the presence of witnesses. He paused. I am declaring it now. Mara felt the hall, feel the weight of this, felt the assembled pack and representatives process what he was saying and what it meant. She felt eyes moving to find her, and finding her at the back, at the edge, where she had been standing at the minimum required distance. The king said, Mara, 7th position Omega of the Ironhollow roll. He said her designation the way he might say a title. He said it with the specific gravity of a man making plain that the words do not diminish the person, but the person elevates the words. My wolf recognized her on the eastern ridge in a blizzard while she was keeping 6 pups alive with nothing but her own warmth and her own will. He did not recognize any difficulty with her designation or her lineage. He recognized her. He looked directly at her across the length of the hall, across all the assembled heads that had turned to look at her, across the enormous and impossible distance between the king's position and the Omega carrier girls. He said, "So do I." The silence held for 1 breath, 2, 3. He said, "I am claiming her as my mate under the accord, and I am inviting her to stand at the front of this hall where she belongs." A pause. "If she'll come." Thread, on her shoulder, turned his gold-clearing eyes toward her and made the satisfied hum that meant he was comfortable and present and not remotely concerned about the outcome. Mara thought. She had spent 23 years being 07 on a list. She had spent 23 years standing at the edges of rooms where she was not certain she was welcome to be closer. She had spent 23 years taking up the minimum required space. She thought about the first time she had held Thread against her ribs and felt his tiny nose press flat against her skin, and had felt, for the first time, the feeling she could not name because the closest word she knew was chosen. She thought about the cave, the cold, the 6 heartbeats she had decided to protect, without knowing if the morning would be kind. She thought about a large, careful hand settling a runt pup against her side while she slept. She thought about a note on plain paper that said, "Your runt is not nothing, neither are you." She walked forward. The crowd parted without her asking it to. She walked the full length of the hall with Thread on her shoulder and her back straight and her hands steady. And she felt every eye in the room on her. And she let them look because she was not taking up minimum required space anymore. She walked until she stood beside him at the front of the hall, and he looked at her, and the controlled surface of him had finally given up trying to contain what was underneath it. And what was underneath it was warm and wide and specific to her, aimed at her, the way a source of heat aims itself at the cold. She said quietly, only for him, "You could have warned me." He said, equally quiet, "You would have told me you could manage on foot." She felt the thing that happened when she almost smiled but was trying not to in public. And Thread chose this moment to transfer himself from her shoulder to the king's, which produced a sound in the assembled hall that was laughter, actual genuine laughter, the kind that broke formal protocol without meaning to. And the king bore this with the expression of someone who was including it. He reached up and settled Thread with one careful hand, and Thread approved of this arrangement and showed his approval by beginning to groom the king's ear. And in the hall, the Ironhollow Pack and the visiting representatives and the king's retinue watched the Alpha King be groomed by a runt pup on his shoulder while he stood beside an Omega carrier girl, and the moment sealed itself into the record the way the territorial documents had formally, permanently, as a thing that had happened and was now simply true. In the weeks that followed, there were more complications, as promised, but they had a different quality now. They were administrative complications rather than existential ones, which was a distinction Mara had learned to appreciate. Her designation was reviewed, as the first advisor had explained it would be. The court conducted its process. The outcome of the process, in technical terms, was that an Omega who had been officially recognized by the Alpha King under the Accord had her status reclassified in a way that the pack rolls did not have a good existing box for. And the clerks created a new designation rather than forcing her into an existing category, which she found satisfying in a way that was difficult to articulate. She went to the king's court. This was the largest change in practical terms. She left the Ironhollow settlement, left the narrow buildings at the perimeter, left the carrier routes she had walked for years. She went with Thread in her arms and the court advisor's briefing folder in her bag, and a clear-eyed understanding that she would spend some months at the edge of a new room, learning where she was permitted to be closer. She did not, as it happened, spend as long at the edge as she had expected. She discovered that a court full of people trained to manage a cold, controlled king was very uncertain about what to do with someone who did not perform uncertainty, who simply asked what is needed and then did it, who engaged the formal structures without being dazzled by them. She discovered that the advisors, once they had recalibrated, were largely more interested in having things work efficiently than in maintaining the specific hierarchies that had seemed fixed before she arrived. She discovered that Kale, the king, her mate, the man with the controlled surface and the warmth underneath it, had been waiting a very long time for someone to be in his rooms at the end of a day, not because they were required to be there, but because they chose to be, which was something the Bond had always known and which he had spent 6 years not believing was possible for him. She learned him the way she had learned everything important in her life slowly, through careful attention to the spaces between things. She learned the specific quality of his silences. She learned that his coldness, the coldness the pack had whispered about, was armor made of years and years of being responsible for everyone and trusted by no one in the particular way of trust that meant someone saw you and not the crown. She learned that his wolf was not controlled so much as patient had been patient, specifically through 6 years of not finding what it was looking for, which was not a failure of his bond mechanism, but an extraordinary exercise in knowing what you are waiting for. She learned that he was funny, privately, with a dry precision that surfaced so rarely in public that the first time she laughed at something he said in an advisory meeting, the advisors around the table looked at her with the stunned expressions of people witnessing an eclipse. She learned that he slept lightly and woke early and spent the first hour of morning with tea and territorial reports, and that he allowed Thread into the morning hour with a patience that was not tolerance but genuine pleasure. That Thread had installed himself as a permanent presence in the king's morning routine, and the king had made no effort to dislodge him. Thread's eyes went fully gold. It happened on a morning in early spring, 6 weeks after they had come to court. Mara saw it first, the last of the cloudiness finally clearing overnight, the gold coming through clean and bright, the eyes of a wolf who had decided he was going to be healthy and had applied himself to this with the same unreasonable stubbornness he applied to everything. She brought him to Kael's morning hour and held him up, and Kael looked at Thread's eyes and then at her, and the warmth in his expression was of the kind that she had come to understand was not general but specific, aimed at her, always aimed at her, the way he had looked across the length of the hall. He said, "Gold." "Gold," she confirmed. He said, "I told you he was not nothing." "You told me neither was I," she said. "Both remain true," he said. Thread submitted to being held up for this examination and then indicated, firmly, that he wished to be set down. He was set down. He walked across the king's desk with tremendous dignity, stepping over the territorial reports with complete indifference to their administrative significance, and settled in the warm patch of morning sun at the window with the authority of something that has always known it would end up here. The mate bond completed that spring, in the quiet of an ordinary evening, not dramatically, not with ceremony, but with the particular ease of something that had been building for months through every look and conversation and deliberate choosing, that had been building, perhaps, since a scent on a ridge in a blizzard stopped a wolf from negotiating with itself. It settled over them like warmth settling over cold stone, thorough and quiet and permanent. Mara felt it the way she had felt. The temperature change in the cave that night, not a sudden heat, but a slow rising, a body of warmth deciding to stay. She did not become a different person in the bond. She remained herself, methodical, quiet, clear-eyed, the carrier girl with the excellent sense of the spaces between things. But the bond added something that she had not known was missing, which was a sense of the space she occupied in the world as having been decided not by roster position, not by designation, not by anyone's assessment of her worth against a standard she had never been given. Decided by something older and less arguable than any of that. Decided in the way Thread had decided to be healthy, by simple application of will to the fact of being here. The court learned to work with her. Some of them learned to be grateful for her. The old advisor, the broad-shouldered one who had come to the settlement courtyard to suggest she step back, became, improbably, someone she trusted for his directness, because he had the quality she most valued, When he changed his mind, he changed it cleanly and moved forward without revisiting the prior position to make excuses for it. She took on a role in the court that had not existed before, and for which the clerks created a new title, as they had created a new designation, because there was no existing box for what she did. What she did was attend to the things that fell between the formal structures, the reports that nobody filed because they were too minor for official runners but too consequential to lose, the pups in the edge houses of every settlement in the Accord, who were too small to be worth anything to the administrative record, and who were, in her careful assessment, worth everything. She made sure they were counted. She made sure they were warm. Thread remained small by wolf standards, though he ceased to be small by the standards of a pup who had been left in a reed basket to be buried. He was, by the summer, a young wolf with gold eyes and unreasonable confidence, and a particular relationship with the alpha king that the court had given up trying to categorize. He slept across both their feet. He attended advisory meetings without invitation and left when he became bored. He was, in the administrative taxonomy of the Accord, entirely without classification, which Mara thought suited him perfectly. On the morning of the first anniversary of the storm, Cale found her at the settlement maps she had been tracking, the edge housing records across the 17 pack, counting the ones they had not yet gotten to, and he stood beside her for a moment, looking at what she was looking at, and then he said, without preamble, "I have been thinking about the eastern ridge." She looked at him. She said, "The cave?" "The cave," he said. "And the fact that a report was filed and I followed it, and I came around an outcropping of rock." "And your wolf stopped negotiating?" she said. "And my wolf stopped negotiating," he said. He looked at her steadily, with the full, specific directness he never applied to anything that didn't matter to him. He said, "I had been telling myself, for 6 years, that the bond might work differently in me, that perhaps it was attenuated, that I had suppressed it with discipline to the point where it would present weakly, if at all. I was prepared for something muted." He paused. "And then there was the smell of pine and wool and cold, and something underneath those things that was yours, simply yours, nothing I had a category for, and it was the opposite of muted. It was the loudest thing I had ever experienced." Mara looked at him for a moment. She said, "I kept 6 pups alive by body heat in a snow cave. I must have smelled extraordinary." He made the sound that had graduated, over the months, from near a smile to actual one. He said, "You smelled like determination and warmth, and someone who had already decided the night was going to go the way she needed it to go." "I wasn't certain of that," she said. "I know," he said. That is what the bond recognized. Not the certainty, the decision to keep going regardless." Thread appeared from beneath the map table, where he had apparently been sleeping, and put both front paws on the map with great authority, and looked at the two of them with his gold eyes in the decisive manner of someone concluding a meeting. Mara looked at him. She looked at Kyle. She thought about a reed basket on a nursery step, and a note on plain paper, and a scent on a ridge in a blizzard, and 6 small heartbeats pressing against her chest in the cold, and the warmth that had come through the dark to sit in front of them and stay. She thought about all the things she had once believed she was not worthy, not enough, not the kind of girl who got chosen, and she thought about how completely and permanently wrong those beliefs had been, not because she had changed, but because they had never been true, had always been a category error, the mistake of measuring something real against a standard made for something else entirely. She reached out and took Cale's hand. He turned his palm up immediately, without hesitation, and closed his fingers around hers with the particular sureness of something that has finally stopped waiting and decided to simply be. Outside, spring was finishing what it had started, and Thread looked at them both with his gold eyes full of satisfaction. And the world held what it had always held: warmth and the people who carry it toward each other through the cold.